come back to near the end of the class. So just keep an eye on that for a moment. Shenemar, as the pasuk, the verse says, with regards to the Ten Commandments, lo tirtzach. Many commentaries sort of pick up right away that the Sefer Chinuch uses two different words, right? Normally, how do we understand the harog? To kill. And how do we understand tirtzach? Murder. And indeed, that is a very important distinction. It's one of the big distinctions that exists between a Jewish thought and some other religious thoughts. There are some purely pacifist religions that will say all killing is wrong. And whether or not it's in defense, I've had conversations with, for example, different religious groups that are extremely pacifist, and in describing sort of Israel's need to defend itself, I would say, what would you have us do in certain instances? And they were very frank and honest and consistent with their theology, which is, we would prefer to be killed rather than to lift up arms in order to defend ourselves. So this distinction, laharog and leretzach, is actually a very important distinction because Judaism never says that you're not allowed to kill. If you're being attacked, you're allowed to kill in defense, right? There's the rodef, the one who's chasing you, the nirdaf who's being chased, he can defend himself. Also, we make a distinction between human life and non-human life. For example, retzach is murdering human beings. You never talk about retzach, murdering a fly, but you might talk about killing a fly. So the distinction is very significant. I think the reason why it's not very relevant or concerned for the Sefer Chinuch is because in his day, the distinction that exists today emanates from the King James Bible. That a distinction was made between murder and kill in the King James Bible as they translated the Hebrew. But in the original, and certainly in the time of the 1100s and 1200s, I think laharog and laretzach were interchangeable, and what mattered next was how you described this specific case. You could use the word laharog to describe a case being chased by someone and then justifiably killing them in self-defense. This happens, by the way, all the time, and whenever you read a text, it's always important to think about where does it first appear and what time period you're reading it. Meaning, are you reading someone who's written in the 20th century, or are you reading the biblical text? I'll give you a good example. What does the word tzedakah mean? Charity, right? More or less. I mean, but of course, people will say that it draws its roots from the word tzedek. In biblical times, there was no such thing as charity. There was no such thing as giving money as a gift to anyone. That didn't exist. The entire sort of social structure, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the mitzvot of Shemitah and Yovel and things along those lines, but the entire sort of welfare system that Judaism envisioned had to do with the land. Meaning if someone was poor, you would give them, like we just read in the last week's parsha, the payah, the corners of your fields to help them out. If someone had to sell themselves into slavery because of debt purposes, first of all, we would cancel their debts come Shemitah. And secondly, if they had to give up their land, they were returned to their land with the Yovel year. There's no mention of tzedakah as a way of helping people out. The closest we get to is what? Giving a loan. The text, the Torah says in Devarim, that you should open up your hand, right? Toch tiftach. Open up your hand. Don't be stingy. Open up your hand when your brother comes to you and needs assistance. But the context of that is clearly as a loan. Give him a loan. Okay? That's it. It never speaks about giving tzedakah. What changed? So when the Jews lost their land, all of our mitzvot to help the poor were connected to land. Right? Give them land, give them pay. Once you no longer have land, so Yovel doesn't help, Shemitah doesn't help, none of these things help anymore. So the rabbis, Chazal, in terms of the Mishnah and later the Talmud, expanded the concept of social welfare and says, well, now we have to introduce something called tzedakah. Whenever the word tzedek was used in the Bible, it's about justice. Mishpat, tzedek, it's about justice. It has nothing to do with charity or giving money or anything like that. The rabbis expanded the definition of that word because of different period of times in which they lived and the different situations they were confronted with. So the only thing I would just say is, and then I'll get your question, is whenever you read a text, what are you reading? If you're reading the biblical text of tzedek, that is a different meaning than if you're reading a rabbinic. And so too it could exist with laharog and the retzach as well. So it should concern us when we see that he uses it interchangeably, and then we should be at peace because we realize in his time it had a different meaning, yes.
And Gary Tova Almada, that was always...
Right, that's correct, to take care of them.
And there's capital punishment, and Shabbat Mitzvah B'nai Noach, and establish a court of law, that's a whole...
Yeah, we're going to get to actually Shabbat Mitzvah B'nai Noach as we go a little bit further. The one question I want to ask, really it's one primary question that I want to ask on this mitzvah, because this mitzvah of not to kill, not to murder an innocent person, right, he adds the word naki, is in some ways different than the other mitzvahs we've been talking about. In some ways, this mitzvah is totally obvious, right? Don't murder. Right? We understand don't murder, we understand not to steal, and we understand not to commit adultery, it breaks up families and things along those lines. And maybe it's different than some of the other mitzvot that need explanations. But the reason why it's totally different, though, is I imagine for those of us sitting in this room, you've probably never been tempted to murder. Now, hopefully, you haven't been tempted to do many of the other mitzvot as well, but we can understand in terms of society that there is temptations for lying, or stealing, or committing adultery. But some of us today, I would imagine the majority of people, okay, obviously there's still murder that exists, but the majority of people, it doesn't even come up as a possibility. You would be almost repulsed by having to think of having to engage in murder. So the Torah, if not anything, should be relevant. So the question is, how are we to understand this mitzvah as a relevant mitzvah for us in our days? Lo tirtzach. You just flip over and say, okay, that's it. I don't have to worry about it because it's never going to come up. So what I want to do is I want to offer about maybe 5 or 6 different ways of sort of investing this particular mitzvah with relevance and meaning for our days today. And then I'm going to end with an interesting case, or hopefully an interesting case that happened here in Yerushalayim at Shir Tzedek Hospital, and try to, I think, one, it will reveal sort of it will sort of reflect some of the things that we've learned, and then as well as it will sort of show exactly how relevant the mitzvah can be on a very practical level. Just a few ideas that I jotted down as possible ways of making it irrelevant. You know what, we're not going to look at it until the very end. I didn't make enough copies, but when we get to it, I'll read it very carefully, but we're only going to read about 3 or 4 lines at the very end of this year. So the first possible way of looking at the relevance is to understand there's a historical background to murder. Perhaps today, we're not overly tempted by murder, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it never existed. In fact, the opposite. Murder is incredibly common throughout human history, and I would argue that it's incredibly common amongst even the good guys, meaning it was a natural tendency, a natural inclination. Think of people like Cain and Abel, or Sarah, right? Sarah, when she expels Ishmael, she assumed that was a death sentence. Sending a person out to the desert with just a little bit of water, that could be a death sentence, but it didn't seem necessarily as an inappropriate behavior. We have Yael, we have Shimon and Levi, David and Uriah. So we have many different cases where it was very common, even within our own tradition. And if today we don't have that same inclination, it's possible that the Torah has done its job. In other words, that all of the mitzvot and receiving the Torah, it actually is supposed to have an impact on how we look at the world and how we behave. So hopefully some of the mitzvot that the Torah is describing, because it's addressing people in that time, are less relevant to us today because the Torah has been effective. There's a map, for example, that shows the world of the rise of monotheism. The rise of monotheism in the time of the Torah was very, very, the population that followed one belief in one God was very, very small, primarily in just this region. And if you look over the last 2,000 years, you see it slowly spreading, so that now more than half the world declares themselves monotheists. So we don't always see progress, because we live only a very short period of time. But if you can sort of look at the entire historical context, you'll see that progress is being made. There's a book by, I think his name is Daniel Pinker, I'm not sure if I got the first name right, from Harvard University. He wrote the book called Our Better Angels. And one of the things he argues in that book is that we live in the absolute safest, most secure, most peaceful time ever. Now he says you don't feel that way. And he says partly that's because we also live in the most globalized, media saturated world ever as well. So if, God forbid, there's a murder 2,000 miles away, you read about it in your paper, or you see it on TV or the internet, whatever the case may be. And in historical times, you would never hear anything except outside your immediate village. But he does the numbers of people who were killed in violent conflicts in each century. And the centuries we've lived in the last few years, even with, this is the amazing thing to think, even with Stalin's Russia and the Holocaust, the 20th century was the least violent, and World War I and World War II was the least violent, and in terms of percentage of people killed by violent activities, in recorded history. That in most of recorded history, when people had a conflict, they immediately went to killing one another. Today, it's already different. We still have lots of violence, way too much, but it's very relatively small, and certainly in the last 20 years, even with the terrorism is like, nothing, a speck of dust in comparison to what used to take place in terms of when there were battles. So we have to realize that progress has been made. That's one thing to think about. Progress being made in terms of our actual successful sort of banishment of certain tendencies doesn't mean, though, that temptations still don't exist, or at least the underlying emotions that might generate the desire for murder. For example, Cain and Abel, what drove them to kill one another? The Midrash says there were three things that drove them. One is suggested they were fighting over a woman, that Cain and Abel. The Midrash says there are three things they might have been fighting over. One was they were fighting over a woman. Which woman? Well, their sister or their mother, depending upon how you look at it. But they basically says, how are we going to continue the world? There's only one choice out there, and they're fighting who is going to marry, if you want to talk about Oedipus, right? Who is going to marry our mother? The other thing they might have been fighting about is religion. They had heard that there will be a Beit HaMikdash built in the future, and the question is, on whose territory was it going to be built? And the third thing they fought over was land. That one says, we can't split up the land evenly, so you take everything above the land, all the metaltalim, I'll take everything below the land, on the land itself. And they, because of this argument, is where then they began to fight, and then eventually kill one another, or Cain kills Abel. Right. So there was you could say the first sin, so to speak, is the sin of jealousy. That's correct. I mean, that's the pshat. You're right that they exist there. The Midrash expands upon it, and the Midrash suggests that all the possibilities of, because it says they went out into the field and then they spoke and then they had the murder. So what did they speak about? So it could have been that. The Midrash says, well, for example, I'll give you the play-by-play of just one of the ideas. One of the ideas is about land. One of them says, how are we going to split up the land? So they say, I'll take all of the land, you take all of the metaltalim, everything on top of the land. And so at one point in time, he says, well, if that's the case, so then you should take off your clothes, because the clothes you have are metaltalim. So give me your clothes. The other one says, if that's the case, then you should fly, because you're on my land. And at that point in time, Cain gets up and kills Abel because of that fight. And each one has a fight along those lines. So those tendencies still exist, right? Today we still, as human beings, fight over land, right? Fight over personal relationships, and fight over religion. And so those still exist, and we have to be careful not to let them ever grow to such an extent where we be prepared to repeat the initial sin. So that's one way of explaining it. Another way is to sort of analogize or use a mashal, meaning, yes, the Torah is talking about murder as murder, but there's other ways of understanding what murder might actually be. There's a Gemara, for example, in Shabbat that talks about a discussion between Abaye and Rabbah. And Abaye, Rav Ashi first starts off and says, anyone who's born under the mazal, the star of Mars, right? If anyone born at a certain time of the year, when Mars is above us, so that person will be a murderer. That's Rav Ashi's statement. Rabbah says, wait a second, I was born at that time. And so at first people try to comfort them and say, no. It doesn't mean that you're a murderer. It means you have the thirst for blood. So what is the thirst for blood? Well, you can either a murderer in the bad, or you can channel it into positive ways. How can you channel the thirst for blood in a positive way? You can become a shochet. You can become a moel. You become a surgeon. You can actually take our negative tendencies and transform them into incredibly positive tendencies. So Rabbah says, wait a second, I'm not any of those three things. So Abaye says, you're still a murderer. Why? And he says, because you paskin halacha. He says, when you paskin halacha, you potentially murder a person, right? When a person comes to you and thinks they're doing something right their whole lives, and you then tell them they're doing something wrong, if it's not done sensitively, if it's not done carefully, you could really actually destroy that person's life. Rav Lichtenstein, Aaron Lichtenstein, told a story at the funeral of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has an opinion about hearing aids. There was a while where the question was raised whether or not hearing aids are allowed to be used on Shabbat, because it's almost like a microphone if you think about it. And microphones were prohibited by and large, and because of electricity and things along those lines. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach made the decision that hearing aids are permitted on Shabbat, and he said that there is a potential concern on some of the electrical issues, but they're rabbinic in nature, and the principle of kavod habriut, of honoring human beings, takes precedence over those rabbinic prohibitions. What's kavod habriut? What's honoring one? Well, can you imagine a person who can't hear and comes to shul and is trying to hear the laning or hear people speak to them, how terrible it is if they are sort of hear nothing and they're isolated from everyone around them. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach apparently heard the story that a rabbi in America, I can't remember which rabbi, I think it's Rav Cutler, held the other way. And therefore, apparently he was walking in the street one day and a person wearing a hearing aid came up to him and said hello. And Rav Cutler felt, and I shouldn't say his name because I don't know if it's in fact him, turned away and would refuse to talk to this person. Because if he spoke to him, then it might generate the hearing aid to be in use, and which would then violate Shabbat. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, I refuse to believe that story. There's no way that he did what was potentially said, because can you imagine how painful it would be? Here's a person already having a difficult time hearing, and then the rabbi comes and sort of shecks him by ignoring him and refusing to talk to him by saying he's doing the wrong thing. So the potential of a posek halacha, someone who uses halacha, which is, we think, it's coming from God, could really destroy a person. You have to be very careful, says Abaye to Rabbah. So one way of understanding murder is take it out of the physical and understand there's other ways that you can really destroy a person's life. The Chafetz Chaim, for example, pointed out, when we do the al-chetz, I think something like 13 of the 43 al-chetz are connected to speech. And the Talmud all the time speaks about how speech is a form of murder if it's used in the wrong way, that our tongue is like an arrow, right? And you shoot it out, it can never come back, and you can really destroy people. In fact, 31 of the 613 commandments are about bad speech, about how speech can be very dangerous. So another way of understanding this mitzvah is to extrapolate out other activities that the rabbis connected to as if you're murdering a person. They say that when you host someone, right, and if you don't walk them out, there are three things that you're supposed to do in terms of hospitality. We learn it from Avraham, who sat under the eshel tree, which is, I guess, translated usually as a tamarisk. But an eshel tree, the Roshei Tevot, right, each of those letters stand for what you're supposed to give to a person who comes and dwells and you're giving hospitality. The Aleph stands for, anyone know? Achila, you give for food. The Shin? It was shtia, drink, but shena, you're close, because the lamed, there's a machloket about it. Is lamed, you have to give them lena, right, lena, to let them sleep in your house, or do you have to give them levaya? You have to walk them out of your house and make sure that they're safe on the way. So most hold that you're not obligated to let half a person sleep in your house, but you do have to walk them out and you have to escort them. And if you don't escort them and something happens to them, you're held responsible. It's very similar to the Egel Rufa concept that we speak about. So the rabbis connect murder to other positive mitzvot that we are perhaps not doing and we have to be more careful with. So that's another way of making it a mitzvah more relevant for us. Another way that they make it more relevant is philosophical. I'll just read to you, you don't need the source sheets for this, how the Sefer Chinuch describes the essence, the shorish, the meaning behind this mitzvah. Shorish mitzvah zo, yadua v'nigla lechol ro'ei hashemesh. This mitzvah is known and obvious to everyone who can see the sun. Ki Hashem bana ha'olam, that God created the world, v'tzivanu lifrot l'rabot, to be fruitful and multiply, k'dei liyashvo lefanav, in order to settle the world, in order to populate the world. And if you are involved in killing, then you are in destroying creation, so you are preventing God's goal, intention of populating the world. The language that the Sefer Chinuch uses here is almost identical to the language he uses with the very first mitzvah we learned of Pru'avu, of being fruitful and multiply. So the world should not be, a vast wasteland. So you get the sense here that the Sefer Chinuch understands this mitzvah, murder, almost a continuation of the first mitzvah of Pru'avu, except in the opposite, right? As Ben Franklin used to say, a penny saved is a penny earned. So here too, a life saved is a life created, right? If there was a life about to be destroyed and you saved that person's life, as if you've created it. And therefore it's a recognition of that obligation that we have to be creators, which by the way is a nice continuation of what we learned last week with the mitzvah of honoring one's parents. Right, honoring one's parents, we said one of the essential elements is to be a creator like God is a creator, to emulate God. So here too, it's sort of a continuation. Maybe that's the connection between the two of them. There's also a philosophical idea here of being able to recognize Tzelem Elokim. Right? Even if you're not going to be murdering someone, by recognizing that you shouldn't murder, you recognize the worth of that individual, of all people. Right? What do we mean by Tzelem Elokim? So the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says that when Cain kills Abel, the Torah uses the plural for blood, right? It says, the bloods of your brother cry up to you. What does it mean, the bloods? It means not just your brother who you killed, but everyone who would come from your brother, all of his potential descendants, right? The world we have today, we're all direct descendants of Adam v'Chava. In other words, those two people created an entire world. And similarly, each individual creates an entire world that comes from them. And so therefore, when you are told not to murder a person, you're also recognizing the value of each person and the value of how everyone is a world unto themselves. I want to add one more philosophical point before I get to the case that I had mentioned. One of the challenges of do not murder is the Akedah. Right? So the Akedah seems to suggest that God is telling Abraham to murder, right? So the truth is I don't think that's the shot of the story. In fact, I think it's the exact opposite. The real religion, the real conclusion of that story, the real message of that story is the conclusion, where God says, do not lift your hand, do not touch that boy at all. The fact that Avram was willing to go kill his son, that, by the way, was very common in those days. They have archaeological evidence, for example, in Carthage, that when they were being attacked, and the water, Carthage is like Libya, right? Algeria, that when they were being attacked by enemies, they took all the babies of the enemies, of their children, and they would throw the children into the water against the rocks as a sacrifice, as a gift to the gods to help defend them. Meaning it was a part of ancient society to sacrifice your children as a sign of how pious you are, right? Because can you think of anything more valuable than your children? If you're willing to kill your child, that shows that you really take your commitment to God. Exactly. Well, I think that's the whole message of the Akedah. When God comes along and says, right, we have Molech also, right, the other religion that Avraham was around were these pagans who killed their children. They put them into fire. Avram grew up in that. In Ur Kasdim and here in Canaan, he would have seen that all over the place. So there's no chiddush, there's no innovation that when God tells him, take your child to sacrifice him, there's no reason why Avram would think there's anything problematic with that. That was the modus operandi of expressing your commitment to your deity. So Avram would do it without thinking about it. The chiddush, the innovation of the whole story of the Akedah, is that in all those other instances, they follow through. Because that's what the God wants. The God wants you to show your piety by killing your child. Our God says, that's exactly what I don't want. But the only way I can show you that that's not what I want is by first you going through and getting to the moment where I can then say, stop, don't do it, don't touch the child, anything like that. That's the ultimate message of the Akedah, I think. But let's say for a moment that we're supposed to learn something different, that Abraham is told to murder his child. So what are we supposed to learn from that? So what some people suggest is there's no way of understanding what morality is except that it emanates from God. Meaning, if it's not a direct statement from God, then how can you know what morality is? It's just your own personal opinion. And so therefore the Torah tells Abraham to murder his son to teach us that morality is not what we think. We think murder is wrong, obviously, but rather it's only what God thinks. At the end of the day, Abraham doesn't go through with it, and so therefore, thank God, something bad doesn't happen. But we have to learn that it's the source. God is the source of morality. Now, as I said, I don't think that's the message of the Akedah, so I don't want to use that example. But I'll give you a different example that might make the case, which is what you raised already of the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, actually. So the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach more or less makes sense. They're totally rational. Don't murder, right? Don't have adultery. Right? We can see how murder could destroy societies and adultery could destroy societies. Don't steal. Set up courts of law. All these mitzvot make perfect sense if you want to have an orderly society. The one that is problematic or is hard to understand is Aver Min HaChai. Don't take an animal while it's still alive and rip off a part of its body. Now, we understand that that's very cruel and not nice, but there's a lot of things that are cruel and not nice. Why specifically is that included as one of the 7 paradigmatic mitzvot for all of society? So what some people suggest is because it's not on the same level of rationality as these other mitzvot of don't murder, don't commit adultery, set up courts, and everything like that. So why don't I do this idea of the Aver Min HaChai? I don't do it, not because rationally it makes sense to me, but because God says, don't do it. And God takes pity on all of his animals, as it says in Tehillim. God takes pity, Rachamav al kol ma'asav, has mercy on all of his creations. So we too have to have mercy on all of God's creations. But the reason why is not because rationally, right, if you were to sit down and just sit on top of a mountain and try to come up with sort of philosophical ideas that all of society should have, and you had to write 7, you'd say probably don't murder and don't steal and set up courts, but you wouldn't get to Aver Min HaChai. The fact that Aver Min HaChai is one of them teaches us that this all has to come from God, that the determination of morality is what God says. If we leave it up to ourselves, you might do things that you think are right that are actually very, very wrong. You take extreme cases, right? Extreme cases, for example, of Nazism. Nazis didn't think they were doing evil. They thought they were actually, right, cleaning their society of something that brought them down, Jews. Same thing with Stalin. Stalin didn't think he was doing evil. He thought that I'm creating the perfect egalitarian society, and the way you create a perfect egalitarian society is if someone has different political beliefs or different religious beliefs, or someone owns land, you just make them all equal, and you don't care about the consequences. So he thought he was doing something right, ethical, but once you leave it up to yourself as opposed to something above you that says, thou shalt not murder, so then you might make that mistake. And by the way, you can even use, right, the Sefer Chinuch, which I didn't read the full statement, you can even use his logic for this very negative purpose. He says the mitzvah is that it shouldn't be, the world should not be left abandoned. And then he says, however, ulam harasha'im hagmorim, but totally wicked people. So those people you're permitted to kill, depending upon what violations they're actually engaged in. And he gives a mashal of why that may be the case. He says, "V'zeu masha amar." This is what Chacham Mechachmeinu, one of our great sages, said with regards to the death of the wicked. Kotzimani mikale mina kerem. Sometimes I take the weeds out of the vineyard. Kilomar, what does that mean? In the destruction of the weeds, things grow much better in the garden. And maybe even the grapes taste a little bit better. And so maybe the world is a little bit better when you get rid of the weeds. That's his language. You could see where someone comes from the good intention and says, this is what would make our society better, and therefore let's do it, even if it means that people are going to have to die as a result. So if we say that morality is based upon what we decide, you might end up with that. If you say morality, in this particular case, thou shalt not murder, comes from God, it's not what you think is best, right? I'll give you another example that happens all the time, and then we'll get to the case that I wanted to speak about. In hospitals, okay, there are many cases, this was more 30 and 40, 50 years ago, there were many cases that doctors, when they were first starting, this is I guess 30 years ago, 1980s, when they were first starting to do certain organ transplants, there wasn't a whole series of literature of how you determine what should be the standards by which you do this. And there were doctors who said, well, if there's someone in a coma, let's take them out of the coma, let's kill them in order to use whatever good organs they have to save someone else's life. For them, that was a purely ethical thing to do. And it makes sense. A person is about to die or doesn't have much more to contribute. Let's take in order to save someone who does. So the Torah comes along and says, well, that also is a form of murder. I'll give you an example. This, for those of you who don't have the source sheets, I apologize. This is the Minchas Chinuch, writing much, much earlier. So he raises a number of different cases of what thou shalt not murder means, where there might be room for confusion. So he first starts off and says, a person is considered a murderer if they kill an old or a young, a gadol or a katan. You might think that a katan doesn't apply, because one place where the Torah makes these statements, it says, makeh ish. If you hit a person, a man, and he dies. So you might think that it doesn't apply to a child. You may think it doesn't apply to a woman. So that's why he goes on to say, but the Torah also says, and this comes back to the initial word we used, a nefesh. So a nefesh applies to a man, a woman, a child, everyone, but doesn't apply necessarily to an animal. Okay, so there's the first distinction he makes. He then talks a little bit about when a child is born. When is the determining factor that a person becomes a nefesh? So he says, once the child has exited the womb, okay, and you can see his fingernails, he says, he's now a human being and deserves full protection. Before that, he is not a nefesh in the same sense. Doesn't mean you can abort without any consideration whatsoever, but it does mean once he comes out, there's no distinction between him and anyone else.
Usually it's when the head is out.
The head is out, yeah. Yatza rosho arehu kiyeled. That's what he says. Once his head is out, he's like a. Then he gives other examples, which, by the way, were in distinction or contradistinction to other societies. What about a shoteh, a total fool? Or what sometimes people would refer to today, the shoteh of the Talmud might be described as someone who is mentally challenged. So he says, what about that case? Or someone who is deaf, mute. All these different cases. He says a person who's not a baal mitzvah. He has no obligation in mitzvah. So he says, this says nefesh. So we don't care whether or not they're obligated in mitzvah or not mitzvah. We don't care if they have intelligence or non-intelligence. We don't care if they're deformed or not deformed. Once you're a nefesh, you have total obligation to protect that life, which, by the way, as I mentioned, is in distinction to, like, Greek society, for example. Greek society, one of their greater values was beauty. So if a child was born deformed, they took him out, they took him to the outskirts of town on the rocks by the cliffs, and they would let nature kill him because it was viewed as a positive way of removing the weeds in order to make the society more beautiful. So again, it's important to have the mitzvah above that says thou shalt not murder to actually explain what this. Now, in doing this, the Minchas Chinuch goes on and gives us one more case, which if we want to make this mitzvah murder relevant, probably is the most relevant in our day. The one possible competing issue is in the Holocaust. The Holocaust had happened quite often, unfortunately, where the question was raised whether or not you can replace a person. Right? If I could escape, there's certain times when Jews were gathered together, and they said tomorrow everyone will be killed, and if one person escapes, 5 will be killed. The question is, are you allowed to escape? Is that considered a murder or not? So that question, by the way, actually is asked quite often, and maybe we'll get to a little bit about the moral dilemmas involved in the case I'm going to mention. So there's a certain period of time which is probably the most relevant for people to understand thou shalt not murder. The possibility that I might be involved in a murder. There's a very famous case of a person who comes to the rabbi and says, I'm able to purchase my son's life. He was already put aside to be killed. I'm allowed to purchase my son's life, but I know they will take someone else. Am I permitted to do so? And the rabbi said, listen, I don't have any books. I'm the only rabbi here in the camp. Please don't ask me that question. And he says, I need to know I can do it. It's tomorrow. Am I permitted to do so? And the rabbi said, please don't ask me. And kept pleading, and rabbi says, what do I do? What do I do? And finally he says, Rabbi, I understand the fact that you are not answering me means that I'm not permitted to do it. Because if you're permitted to do it, you would tell me right away it's permitted. And the rabbi said, oh, don't read that into it. I can't take the responsibility. He says, I understand, I accept. And he did not save his son's life, and he accepted he accepted that consequence. So there was a period of time that was probably the most relevant question in terms of this mitzvah. Today, I would say the mitzvah is most relevant coming to another thing that the Minchas Chinuch then adds as well. He says as follows: Hahoreg bari or chole afilu goses bidei shamayim. A person who kills a healthy person or a sick person, doesn't make a difference, even if that sick person is a goses. A goses is someone who is definitely going to die, no doubt about it. There's no coming back. Right? We're not talking about someone who may be saved. There's no question they're going to die, and their death is going to be immediate. And there's different definitions, but traditional is 24 hours. So the person is going to die anyway within the next 12 hours. If you kill them, that's also murder. Now that's an incredibly important value that you learn from Judaism, from the halacha, that there's no distinction in life once a child is born till once a person is completely dead. There's no distinction in life. Life is infinite, so you can't compare infinity to infinity. Now, why has that become obviously most relevant in our day? It's because today, whether it's a question of organ transplant or people who are under a great deal of pain near the end of their lives, what are the obligations in terms of the hospital staff and medical, to keep a person alive? And what are you permitted to do, not permitted to do? What is killing the person? What is simply not doing extraordinary means to save them? These are a lot of different considerations. Heroic measures, exactly.
Like how far do you have to go to
Right, you're not obligated in heroic measures or extraordinary measures, but you're not allowed to precipitate death either. And there's a lot of different ways this comes to play. About do not resuscitate. You don't always have an obligation to resuscitate, but sometimes you do. There are certain hospitals, for example, have a very interesting way. I think Shari Tzedek did this for some time. That once you hook someone up to a machine that saves their lives, you're not allowed to ever remove that from them, right? Because that would be taking away. The problem is sometimes there's not a lot, but you don't always have to hook the person up in the first place, right? And sometimes the decision is made right away to hook them up, and then the person could unfortunately, linger for years and years and years in a terrible state. And perhaps, in retrospect, people would say, I wish I never took that extra means to hook them in the first place. So I think Shari Tzedek does this, at least at some point in time they did it, is that some of the machines have to be rebooted every 24 hours. In other words, the decision has to be remade whether or not to re-hook them up so you don't get into the state where a person is lingering in that way. So let me tell you the case. And the case I'm going to share with you, I think hits upon a lot of the different issues we mentioned. So the case is as follows. There was a 33-year-old woman who was walking in the streets. I think it was actually on Emek Ephraim in the past couple of decades. She was pregnant. She falls, slips. She bangs her head on stone, and she's rushed to Shir Tzedek Hospital, and it appears that she is brain dead. She's pregnant. Now, there's an argument amongst many sources about, is brain death, okay? The Gemara speaks about breathing as a determining factor if someone is alive or dead. But subsequent to this, for example, I had a rabbi at Yeshiva University, Rabbi Moshe Tender, who says brain death is when there's no communication between the brain and the rest of the body. It's as if your brainstem has been cut off. He says the comparison is to like a chicken. When you cut off the head of a chicken, the chicken may still run around for a little bit, but the chicken is dead, right? There's no, whereas I was on the 5th floor, this is where we learned in Yeshiva, this class right next to him was taught by Rabbi David Bleich, J. David Bleich. I'm not sure if people have heard him. He believed only the traditional definition of death, which was by respiration, by the heart, was a determining factor, and brain death was not death. Now, they had some real violent arguments, as you can imagine, because if you hold that brain death is death, then therefore when a person dies, you want to take their organs. If a person's donating their organs are still working. And so therefore, you want to do it right then and there, take the heart and give it to someone, you could save a life. If, however, you say that, no, the heart has to die, the respiration has to stop. So here's, according to Rav Tendler, this person is dead, but you're waiting till their heart dies, and then you can no longer do the transplant. So you're killing a potential recipient. Rabbi J. David Bleich held the opposite. He says brain death is not death. So if you take the heart out of that person, you're killing that person. Right? So it's a real issue of determining the factors. So Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, he holds like Rabbi J. David Bleich, and says that brain death is not death. So he believes the woman is still alive, and there's a fetus within her. The question was asked, the doctor said, we have to do an operation, we have to do a cesarean on this baby, or otherwise the baby is going to die as well. That the mother can't sustain the baby in this state. The point, however, was made that if they do the cesarean and they take the baby out, and they may save the baby's life, you're hastening the death of the mother. Meaning, brain death, people already think she's dead. But if you hold like Rav Waldenberg and J. David Bleich, she's still alive, and now you're hastening also her heart because of this operation. And so therefore, you should not be permitted to do this cesarean section based upon that idea.
Is the baby a rotate?
So there's a lot of questions that come up. Normally we say a baby is a rodef, so you shouldn't have to do the thing because she's alive. Rabbi Waldenberg, however, did something very interesting. Rabbi Waldenberg says you can do the operation. Now, you have to understand, why would he say you can do the operation? Not only does he believe that the woman is still alive, and therefore you should not do anything that threatens her life, which would be this baby as well. Ki'ilu, she's a rodef of sorts. But in addition to that, he actually has a fairly liberal point of view for halachic scholars on abortion. He says the fetus is not a life, is not a nefesh yet, as we just saw. Only when the baby comes out. Doesn't mean you can do abortions without any consideration whatsoever, but it also means that you're not allowed to, the baby doesn't have the same status as the mother. He says, for example, if there's an instance where there's a number of babies, a number of fetuses in the womb, and if you allow all of them to come to term, they'll all die. But if you abort one and it will save the life of the other, you're allowed to do that. He says there's no problem with doing that. So he clearly holds that the fetus is not a nefesh, it's not a life in the same way. He also had something with regards to a tay-sex child. If the tay-sex child is going to live a miserable life and die a painful death in a very short period of time, and you know this early enough on, there were certain instances where he allowed abortion there as well. So Rav Waldenberg is a real sort of mystery in this regard. On one hand, he holds that the woman is still alive. On the other hand, he holds that the fetus is not a life. And yet, nevertheless, he held that you should do the operation to try to save the child, even if it hastens the death of the mother. So how can we possibly understand and explain his position? So there's a lot of different ways of understanding it. But one of the ones that people put forth is based upon a teaching of the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish gives the following case. A person pulls an arrow, and he shoots an arrow at, let's say, 3 or 4 people. It's going to hit these 3 or 4 people, and it will kill them all. You have the ability to deflect the arrow, and if you deflect the arrow, you'll save these 3 or 4 people, but you'll kill another person. Are you allowed to do that or not? So the Chazon Ish says you're allowed to do that. Okay, you're allowed to save those 3 or 4 people, even if it means killing 1 person.
So we're talking of numbers.
Well, that's what he seems to be talking about, right? But let me back up from the Chazon Ish and give you what that's called trolley car ethics. It's described in all these ethics classes whenever you go to university and the like. Let's say there's a trolley car, okay? And the trolley car is out of control, and it's racing towards 50 people. And you have a switch, and you can pull the switch. And if you pull the switch, the trolley car that's going to hit 50 people will be instantly pulled and go in a different direction. But as it goes in a different direction, there's one person you can't warn ahead of time, and he's going to be killed. So how many of you think, if you're the person right by the switch, you can do that? To save the 50, but it would also end up killing another person. Anyone want to? What?
Same logic.
Same logic, right? So Chazon Ish seemingly would say you can do it. But I bet you it's not that it's the numbers issue. I think he would say you can do it, but I don't think it's a numbers issue. Because I'll give you another case. The trolley car is barreling towards 50 people. You can't, there's no switch, or you can't get to the switch in time. But you see a very heavy set man standing on a bridge above the trolley car. You could run and you could push this one guy off the bridge, and he'll fall on the tracks, and he'll stop, or he'll derail the trolley, and so therefore he'll save the 50 people. But you'll be killing this individual. How many of you would say, I would do it? No way, right. So what's the difference? In each case, one person is dying and 50 people are being saved. So what's the difference? So one of the ways to look at these questions is, what is the moral basis for your making the decision? So in this instance, there's utilitarians, and they say it's just a question of numbers. So they would say in both instances you can do both, because you're doing the maximum good for the maximum number of people. But what the others say, sort of more Kantian, would say, no. Each act is, you don't look at the result, you look at the act. So in this case, when you push that person off, you're murdering him. So why is the other case permissible, though? So the Chazon Ish actually gives us the language to use it. He says, what is the act you're doing when you hit the arrow away? The act you're doing when you hit the arrow away is rescuing or saving those 3 or 4 people that will be killed by the arrow. It is not murdering that one individual. That's a result of what might take place, but your kavana, your action, your whole thing that you're doing is rescuing. And he says, if you call it hatzala, that's different than what are you doing when you push the person off, or if you aim straight for one person, or if you give one person over. Even though your intention is really to save other people, the act itself is described as murder. And he says, if that's how you describe the act, so that's the ethical weight of that particular act. So in the case of the pushing the person off, that's murder. You're not allowed to do so. In the case of switch, that's rescuing. It's the same result. But the way you define the act makes all the difference in the world. We have this, by the way, with regards to Hilchot Shabbat, right? Are you allowed to do an act that will eventually lead to an isur, a prohibition? Right? There's a concept called psik resha. You know the psik resha? Like, for example, if I want to move this table, and the only way I can move it is like pulling pit, and I will be plowing the ground as I do it, that's a psik resha. It's going to definitely happen no matter what, and so therefore I'm not allowed to do it because that's a violation of Shabbat. But then there's another concept called a psik resha de lo nichale. A psik resha, it's going to happen, but you don't want it to happen. Not only you don't care, you really don't want it to happen. You're going to try for it not to happen, and maybe in all cases it doesn't happen. Well, that's then different. So, for example, there's certain cases. Is the refrigerator light on or off? It happens sometimes. Did I forget? Am I allowed to open the door? Well, you're hoping that the refrigerator light is not on, and there's a good chance that it's not on. Now, if you open the door and the light is on, it automatically causes the light to come on. But your intention is not about turning on the light, and you don't want the light to turn on. So in those instances, you're allowed to do that act. So in the same way, you can, well, if you don't know, even though it definitely will turn the light on if in fact the light is on. So yeah, you're opening because it's a psik resha, de lo nichale. You don't want it to happen, you hope it doesn't happen, and maybe it will, and in some cases it's not going to happen. So take all this idea back to the case of Rav Waldenberg. When you do the operation, I almost revealed it, right? When you try to do the cesarean for the baby, what is your kavana? What are you doing at that point in time? How do you describe that act? Is that act murdering the mother, or is that act rescuing the child? So what he says is, don't look at the mother at this point in time. What is the actual act you're doing? You are trying to save this child's life. You don't want the mother to die. If that was your intention, for sure you can't do it, obviously. And there's not a guarantee that you're murdering the mother. You're hastening her death, most likely, but there's a chance that maybe getting the baby out will be beneficial. It's a small chance.
Well, that depends what stage of the pregnancy she is.
Stage of the pregnancy. And so at this point in time, what Rav Waldenberg seems to be suggesting is how you define the act makes a huge difference even though the results may be the same. So since your intention and your definition of the act is rescuing, it's like the Chazon Ish rescuing, so then it becomes a permissible act in his understanding, even though otherwise he believes the woman is alive and he believes that the fetus is not a nefesh, but because it's a totally different way of understanding the problem. So one of the things I like about that particular case is because it sort of tests us with what is our belief system, right? When you do the trolley case and you have no choice, you have to choose one thing or the other, most of us will not push the person off, but we may do the lever. And why? And the answer we now sort of come to realize is, well, it's how we are defining the act and what's really taking place there. And so through this case, we reveal a little bit of understanding of what is murder, right? And the other reason I like the case is I think it hits upon a lot of the other cases of, it explains to us, the importance of words, the explanation, and all the other cases we had in that instance, yeah.
Mother's supposed to be a grandma, that is not necessary.
Right, so that's a whole nother topic, but it's also a very relevant topic to this concept of grama. Are you causing it, and are you the proximate cause?
Are you sure that's going to be the outcome?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
By the way, the Minchas Chinuch raises a question, for example. He says, if you cause someone to be a goses, or if you cause someone and then they die from the injury, but not right away, meaning let's say you hit someone and they have to go to a hospital, and they're there for a week, and then they die because, let's say,
They got an infection.
they had an infection. Are you responsible for that or not? So he actually says in that instance, you're responsible b'dei shamayim, but not in the courts. You would not be called the murderer for that instance.
The insurance companies pick it up.
Because the grama, there's a whole series of grama is a very interesting topic in general. I'll just say this as an aside. I mean, we're finishing up. There's a Gemara in Sanhedrin that talks a lot about issues of grama being the direct cause and if there's a time. So, for example, if you tie someone up and you put them in a room and they die of starvation, that's not considered murder. If you tie someone up and you put them in the sun and they die of the heat, that is considered murder. If you tie someone up and put him in front of a lion and he dies, that isn't considered murder. All these cases you're punished still, but and if you tie him up and put him in a bunch of mosquitoes, it is considered. What's the difference in all these cases? So the question is, are you the direct cause? So for example, when you put a person in a room and he starves to death, well, you didn't cause him to start starving. Maybe, in fact, he just had a big meal. Maybe it's good for the first, 10 hours not to eat, and then it becomes bad. But if you put him in the sun, right away the sun begins to heat him up. It begins the death process. If you put him outside when it's dark and then the sun comes up, you would also be exempt. Meaning, even though you're the cause, it's not, at that point in time, the direct cause. Same thing with a lion. Maybe the lion's already eaten and he won't attack you. This is according to the Gemara. I mean, again, not everyone would necessarily agree with this idea. The mosquitoes, you put them there, they instantly attack you regardless, no matter what, and will slowly eat you to death. Again, I don't know, the case is a little bit extreme in those instances, but it gives you an idea of the rabbis are trying to understand what is direct cause, what is proximate cause, what is these concepts of contributory negligence.
Your kavana does not have.
And well, again, in all these instances, you're punished, right? The question is whether or not you're punished bidei shamayim, or if you're punished by, does the court have enough to put you to death right here and there? And that becomes a kavana retroactively, because it's hard to know what your kavana is. But when you tie up a person, apparently, and put them in a room, it may be that your kavana was not to kill them, and you were going to come back, but then you forgot. Where if you put them right outside in the sun, it's easier for the rabbis to say, no, your kavana was always to kill him.
Well, the Jewish court sometimes will offer someone a salty food.
Yeah.
And what was that about?
No, so
They
there is,
died from thirst or-
no, there were, so Rav Waldenberg said, now, unfortunately, the case itself is a sad case. They ended up doing the operation, and the details of the case. They ended up doing the operation, and both the baby and the mother passed away. Rav Waldenberg was not actually asked before they did it. What happened before they did it is the hospital wanted to do it. The father says, I don't want you to do it, the thing. Or maybe it was vice versa. The father wanted them to do it, and the hospital said, we won't do it. They actually went to court. The court permitted them to do it, and they died. And then they came to Rav Waldenberg and said, what would you have said? Meaning, what would the halakha, what should the policy be? He was the rabbi of Shari Tzedek Hospital, okay? So he wasn't there at this specific time. What would have the policy been? And then that's when he wrote his decision that said, I would have said you could do the operation.
Well, an ethics committee, you can ahead of time.
Yeah, normally you do have, I mean, it was the doctor's ethics committee, but they hadn't have a chance to ask him specifically of what to do in that case. So your question about the salt.
Salty food, what is that?
So there are certain instances, the Jewish courts did not have prison. So if a person was found innocent, in quotation marks, for purely technical reasons, right? He was, there were two witnesses and they saw him do it, but they didn't warn him. If you do, so the person gets off, but this person's the murderer, there's no question, everyone knows. So you can't put him in prison and you can't put him to death. So what do you do? So in instances where you knew for sure, 100%, the rabbis would step in and say, okay, we're going to punish you for a different reason. We're not punishing you for murder, but it couldn't be direct. So in these instances, there were different models. The one that I'm more familiar with is that they would not have a person eat for several days, and their stomach would therefore shrink, and then they would feed them barley, and then they would feed them lots of water. So the barley expanded in their stomach, and then they died of that. The salt is a similar idea, that these were extra legal measures by which
They refuse the barley, they refuse the salty food, and then they die of starvation.
it was basically the court says that we can't kill you. But,
You kill
sometimes the rabbis would get involved. It's like a public policy type of things. We can't punish you, but then there's extra legal punishments in the sense that, like, for example, a person doesn't, if a person disobeys what the rabbis say, even if it's not a halacha, so they have what's called the lashes of rebellion. Meaning the rabbis could give you lashes even if you didn't violate a specific prohibition that normally brings lashes because you violated the words of the court. They have it in American law too also. What do they call it? They call it contempt of court, right? They'll put you in prison, not because of the crime you did, but because you refused to show up to court or you refused to testify, and the judge could put you in prison. So it's a similar idea in that regard. Okay, have a nice week.